Sarah had always believed that life was a gift, but now, at just 25 years old, it seemed that gift was being taken away too soon. The doctors had confirmed the worst, stage 4 cancer. Her mother, who had been her only support since her father's passing, had tried everything to save her. She had sold nearly everything they owned, hoping for a miracle, but nothing had worked. Now, the latest test results had delivered the most devastating news yet. Sarah had only 3 days left to live. As she lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, tears streamed down her face. The weight of her fate pressed down on her like an unbearable burden. She thought of all the dreams she would never fulfill, the places she would never visit, and the love she would never experience. But most of all, she thought of her mother, her rock, her only family, who had done everything to keep her alive. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, her eyes filled with pain she was trying so hard to hide. "Sarah, my love, please don't cry," she whispered. Sarah turned her head to her mother and forced a small, weak smile. Mum. Since I only have 3 days left, I want to do something special before I go." Her mother wiped her tears and tried to stay strong for her daughter. "Anything, my love. Just tell me. I want to dress up in my best gown, go to a nice restaurant and enjoy my last moments. I just want to feel normal, even if it's just for a little while," Sarah said, her voice filled with longing. Her mother hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "All right. I will give you some medication that will make you strong enough for a few hours, but you have to promise me that as soon as you start feeling weak, you'll let me bring you back here." Sarah nodded. "I promise." That evening, Sarah dressed in a beautiful gown, one of the few things they had left that hadn't been sold. She looked at herself in the mirror, ignoring the paleness of her skin and the exhaustion in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she felt like herself again. Her mother smiled, though her eyes were filled with unshed tears. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." Sarah took a deep breath. "Let's go." They arrived at an upscale restaurant in town. The warm lights and the gentle hum of conversation made it feel like a world far away from hospitals and sickness. Her mother helped her to a table before stepping outside to take a call, leaving Sarah alone. A few minutes later, a man walked in. John, the owner of the restaurant, was known for being arrogant and disrespectful. He didn't care for people's feelings, and he certainly didn't believe in love. As his eyes scanned the room, he landed on Sarah, sitting alone at a table. Something about her caught his attention, though he wasn't sure what. Without hesitation, he walked over. "Hey, pretty girl, can I have your number?" His voice was laced with overconfidence. Sarah barely spared him a glance, ignoring him completely. John frowned and pulled the wine in his hand on Ciro's clothes, unaccustomed to being ignored. He chuckled, pulling out his wallet and tossing a few bills onto the table. "Take this. I bet this money can buy 8 of that cheap gown you're wearing." Sarah's eyes darkened with anger. Without a second thought, she slapped him across the face. The sound echoed through the restaurant, leaving everyone stunned. John's expression twisted with fury. "Security, get her out of here," he barked. As the security guards grabbed Sarah's arms, something unexpected happened. Her body went limp, and she collapsed to the floor. The entire restaurant fell silent. John's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "I didn't touch her, I swear," he stammered, but guilt was already creeping into his mind. Without another thought, he scooped Sarah into his arms and carried her to his car. He drove faster than he ever had before, his heart racing as he reached the hospital. The moment they arrived, Sarah's mother ran to them. "What happened?" she cried. A bystander explained the situation, and Sarah's mother turned to John with fire in her eyes. "You heartless man! Do you even know she has cancer? She only has 3 days left to live, and you just made her final moments miserable." John felt something strange in his chest, something he had never felt before. Was it guilt? Regret? He didn't know. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he wanted to fix something. As Sarah was wheeled into the hospital, John stood frozen in place. And for the first time in his life, he felt fear. Fear that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. John stood frozen at the hospital entrance, his heart pounding in a way he had never felt before. He watched as the doctors and nurses rushed Sarah into a room, her mother following closely behind. The words of Sarah's mother echoed in his mind. She only has 3 days left to live, and you just made her final moments miserable. John swallowed hard. He had never cared much about other people's feelings. He had always believed that money and power were the only things that mattered. But now, for the first time, he felt ashamed. After what felt like hours, he finally gathered the courage to step inside. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair. As he approached the waiting area, he saw Sarah's mother sitting on a chair, her head buried in her hands. He cleared his throat. "Mum, Sarah's mother lifted her head, her eyes filled with exhaustion and pain. "What do you want?" she asked coldly. John hesitated. He had never apologized to anyone before. I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I didn't know she was sick. I didn't mean to hurt her." Sarah's mother sighed. "Sorry won't change anything now. My daughter is running out of time." John felt a strange pang in his chest. He didn't understand why, but he couldn't bear the thought of Sarah suffering. "Can I see her?" he asked hesitantly. Sarah's mother stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "She's awake, but be careful with your words." John nodded and walked toward Sarah's hospital room. When he stepped inside, he found her lying on the bed, looking fragile yet beautiful. She turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice weak but steady. John scratched the back of his neck, unsure of what to say. I brought you something." "Huh?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Food? After ruining my last outing?" John sighed and placed a small bag on the table. "I know I messed up, so I wanted to do something to make it up to you." Sarah looked at him skeptically. "And what exactly do you think will make up for ruining my last wish?" John hesitated, then smiled. "Come with me." Sarah frowned. "I can barely walk." "I'll help you," John said, offering his hand. After a moment of hesitation, Sarah took it. Slowly, he led her down the hospital corridor. When they reached the door at the end, he pushed it open. Inside was a small but beautifully decorated room. The hospital bed had been replaced with a cozy dinner setup, soft lights, a table set for two, and a beautiful dress hanging by the side. Sarah gasped. "You did this?" John nodded. "I wanted to give you the dinner you wished for." For the first time in a long while, Sarah smiled. And for the first time in his life, John felt like he had done something right. Sarah stood in the doorway of the beautifully decorated hospital room, her eyes wide with surprise. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Just hours ago she had been humiliated, thrown out of a restaurant, and reminded of how little time she had left. But now, here she was, staring at a perfect dinner setup, arranged by the very man who had ruined her day. "John, why did you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John scratched the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I felt bad," he admitted. "I wanted to make things right. You wanted a special evening and I ruined it. So I thought I'd try again." Sarah's heart softened a little. She had spent years believing that most people only cared about themselves, and John had seemed to be the perfect example of that. But now here he was, showing a side she never expected. She turned to her mother, who had been watching quietly. "Mum, can I?" Her mother hesitated, then sighed. "Just for an hour, sweetheart, and don't forget your medication." Sarah smiled and nodded. With her mother's help, she put on the elegant gown John had arranged for her. It was a soft blue, flowing and light, making her feel like a princess despite her weakness. John watched her, his usual arrogance replaced by something softer. "You look nice," he said awkwardly. Sarah chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." He pulled out a chair for her and she sat down carefully. The food was simple but warm and comforting. As they ate, they talked. Not about illness or pain, but about life. "I've never seen you here before," Sarah said. "Do you always treat people the way you treated me at the restaurant?" John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I've never really cared about people much. I grew up believing that money and power were the only things that mattered." Sarah tilted her head. "And now?" John hesitated. "Now, I'm not so sure anymore." For the first time in his life, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He had spent years chasing wealth, treating people as if they were beneath him. But Sarah, someone who had only 3 days left to live, was still smiling, still finding joy in the little moments. He had never met anyone like her before. As the evening continued, Sarah found herself enjoying John's company more than she expected. He wasn't just the arrogant restaurant owner anymore. There was something else, something hidden beneath his cold exterior. After an hour, Sarah's mother knocked on the door. "Time's up, sweetheart." Sarah sighed and turned to John. "Thank you, and I forgive you. I didn't think I'd smile today, but you made it happen." John nodded, his heart feeling unexpectedly heavy. "I'm glad." As she was wheeled back to her hospital bed, John watched her go, his mind racing with a thought that scared him. He didn't want her to die, and for the first time in his life, he wanted to fight for something other than himself. John couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned, his mind consumed by thoughts of Sarah. He had met many people in his life, but none had ever affected him the way she did. She was dying, yet she had more life in her than he had ever seen in anyone. The thought of her fading away in just a few days made his chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. The next morning he found himself back at the hospital, pacing outside Sarah's room. When her mother stepped out, looking exhausted and worn, John hesitated before speaking. "Anne, is there really no way to save Sarah?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Sarah's mother looked at him in surprise, then sighed. "There's only one option, but it's impossible for us," she said. "The only hospital that can perform surgery for her stage of cancer is in Paris, but we don't have the money and we've already sold everything we own." John's heart pounded. "How much would it cost?" "A fortune," she said bitterly. "Even if we had the money for the surgery, we couldn't afford the flight, the stay, or anything else. It's hopeless." John clenched his fists. He had spent his life chasing wealth, but now, for the first time, he wanted to use it for something meaningful. "Let me handle it," he said firmly. Sarah's mother blinked in shock. "What?" "I'll find the money," he repeated. "I'll make sure Sarah gets to Paris." "But why would you do that?" she asked, suspicion in her voice. John hesitated. He didn't fully understand it himself. All he knew was that he couldn't let Sarah die, not when she still had so much to live for. "Because she deserves a chance," he said, "and because I want to save her." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the hospital, his mind racing. He had a restaurant, a thriving business, and enough money to live comfortably, but saving Sarah would require more than that. By noon, he made a decision. He sold his restaurant. It wasn't easy. The restaurant had been his pride, his proof of success, but compared to Sarah's life, it suddenly felt worthless. Within hours, he gathered the funds, booked the flight, and arranged for Sarah's immediate transfer to Paris. That night, he returned to the hospital, finding Sarah sitting up in bed, looking weaker than before. She glanced at him in confusion. "You're back again?" John took a deep breath. "Pack your things. We're going to Paris." Sarah frowned. What are you talking about? John stepped closer. I sold my restaurant. I got the money. We're flying tonight. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. You did what? I'm not letting you die, Sarah, John said firmly. You're too special for that. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. No one had ever fought for her like this before. And for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. The hospital room was silent as Sarah stared at John, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. You sold your restaurant, she whispered, her voice shaky. John nodded. Yes, and the flight is booked. We leave tonight. Sarah's mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. John, that was your life. Why would you do something like this? John took a deep breath. Because Sarah deserves a chance, and I couldn't live with myself if I just stood by and did nothing. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She had spent so much time preparing for death that she had forgotten what it felt like to have hope. Now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might have a future. But reality hit her just as quickly. John, what if the surgery doesn't work? What if I don't make it? John stepped closer and gently held her hand. Then at least we fought for it, he said softly. At least we tried. Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. Okay, let's go to Paris. Hours later, Sarah was in an ambulance headed to the airport. The hospital had arranged for a medical escort to ensure she was stable during the flight. John sat beside her, holding her hand the entire time. As the plane took off, Sarah glanced at him. You know, I never thought I'd leave this country, she murmured. John smiled slightly. Well, now you're on your way to Paris. Sarah chuckled weakly. Not exactly how I imagined my first trip. John smirked. Next time, we'll go for a real vacation. She looked at him, her heart swelling. You really believe I'll make it, don't you? John squeezed her hand. I have to. The flight was long, and Sarah drifted in and out of sleep. Each time she woke up, John was still there, watching over her. He had changed so much in such a short time. The arrogant, selfish man she had met just days ago was gone. In his place was someone who cared, someone willing to give up everything to save her. When they landed, an ambulance was already waiting. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors immediately began preparing her for surgery. John and Sarah's mother waited anxiously in the hallway as the medical team worked. John paced back and forth, unable to sit still. What if we were too late? He muttered. Sarah's mother placed a hand on his shoulder. We did everything we could, John. Now we just have to pray. Hours passed. Then, finally, a doctor stepped out. His expression was serious, but there was a hint of something else. Relief. The surgery was successful, he said. Sarah is going to live. John exhaled sharply, his knees almost giving out. He had never felt this kind of joy before. Sarah was alive. Tears streamed down Sarah's mother's face as she covered her mouth in shock. John felt an overwhelming relief wash over him, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel true happiness. Can we see her? Sarah's mother asked, her voice shaking. The doctor nodded. She's still unconscious, but you can sit with her while she recovers. John and Sarah's mother rushed inside the room. Sarah lay on the hospital bed, looking fragile but peaceful. The sound of the heart monitor beeping steadily was the sweetest sound John had ever heard. He sat beside her and gently took her hand. You did it, Sarah. You fought. Sarah's mother placed a hand on John's shoulder. I don't know how to thank you. You gave up everything to save her. John shook his head. She's the one who saved me. The next day, Sarah woke up slowly. At first, she panicked, seeing the unfamiliar white walls and hearing voices speaking French. Where am I? She murmured, her throat dry. John leaned forward with a smile. In Paris. And alive. Sarah blinked, trying to process his words. I made it. Sarah's mother rushed to her side, tears in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, the surgery was a success. You're going to be okay." A fresh wave of emotions hit Sarah and she covered her face, crying softly. She had been ready to die, had accepted her fate, but now she had been given a second chance. She looked at John. "You really did all this for me?" John smirked. "I told you, didn't I? You're special." Sarah smiled, her heart full. She had lost so much, but in the midst of it all she had found something she never expected: love. After weeks of recovery in Paris, Sarah was finally well enough to return home. The journey back was filled with laughter and relief. John never left her side, and Sarah's mother watched them with a knowing smile. As the plane landed, Sarah turned to John. "So, what now? You don't have a restaurant anymore?" John chuckled. "I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll start a new business, something different, something meaningful." Sarah smiled. "Whatever you do, just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "You'll stay in my life," she said softly. John took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Months later, Sarah stood outside a beautiful new restaurant. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was John's new business, a place dedicated to bringing people together. And at the entrance, the sign read, "Sarah's Place." Sarah turned to John, tears in her eyes. "You named it after me?" John smiled. "Of course. You changed my life. You showed me that money isn't everything. Love is what makes life worth living." Sarah hugged him tightly. "I love you, John." John held her close. "And I love you too." As they stood together, watching the restaurant fill with customers, they knew one thing for certain. Love had given them both a second chance at life. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe.